This week on the right side, unity prevails as the Wildrose and PC parties vote to unite, new BC NDP Premier John Horgan unveils his experienced cabinet, $1 billion from Canadian mining firms is lost in the Congo, and experts argue for repatriating former Canadian ISIL fighters. This is The Right Side, episode 26, recorded Saturday, July 22nd, 2017, The Experience of Unity. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another episode of The Right Side. Myself and Patrick are here this week, as we are every week. Welcome back.
It's good to be back again. We're getting all the way through July. It's amazing how fast it's gone by.
Indeed it is. So if you're joining us for the first time, The Right Side aims to cut through bias and sensationalism in the mainstream media and tell the truthful side of the story that's missed by the people on the left at various outlets like the Huffington Post and missed by the right, like people at the Rebel. And pick out the little gems that appear from either of these folks on either side. So,
and even more importantly, the people that either claim to not be on the left or the right, more like the mainstream
global CTV.
Where bias and sensationalism can also take place. So it's important that it's not just one political spectrum that we're examining and raising our metaphorical eyebrows at, shall we say.
Indeed. So let us begin this week in Alberta. July 22nd, 2017, a day that was marked on the calendar for many people. Today was a date that the Wildrose and Progressive Conservative parties in Alberta held their referendum on unity between the two parties. The referendum was held in person and online for each of those parties. You could vote by phone, online, or in person, depending on where you were in the province. And each of the parties had different thresholds for the vote to be successful. Those thresholds were 75% for the Wildrose and 50% for the PCs, or Progressive Conservatives. The Wildrose opted for unity with 95% voting in favor. 24,598 people voted. 23,466 of those voted yes. The PCs also overwhelmingly voted in favor of unity with 95% support on their end. They had 27,060 votes with 25,692 voting yes. So,
it's quite remarkable that the percentages were the exact same for both parties.
It really is, and because of the way the parties are structured and because of the way the membership works and the different kinds of membership that each of the parties attract, one would expect that you would have a little bit more difference in the amount of people that were voting in this. Obviously, the PCs are a more traditional political party, whereas the Wildrose swings more to the grassroots side here in Alberta, relying on support of everyday Albertans. But as we can see, both have come together to vote in favor of unity. So what does this mean going forward? Well, in the coming days, the Wildrose and PC parties will both be dissolved. So we have to keep in mind that the Progressive Conservatives are the party that ruled Alberta for 44 years, from 1971 to 2015, and that party will be dissolved. The Wildrose party has been around for about a decade, give or take, but once these are both dissolved, a new United Conservative Party will be registered with Elections Alberta, and that is supposed to happen within the coming days, early this week. A combined caucus meeting has already been scheduled for early in the week, and at this caucus meeting, they will choose an interim leader who will run the party and take care of things in the summer, and that person will be in control of the party until the leadership vote that happens later this October. Brian Jean had this to offer on the result. We've seen this renewal in the past, from Peter Lougheed to Ralph Klein, a moment in history when conservatives in this province and ordinary working folk said it's time for something new and it's time to have leadership that sticks up for regular people of our province. I am excited to get to work in supporting a new United Conservative Party. On Twitter And live at the PC event in Calgary, Jason Kenney commented, "To those who voted yes, thank you for putting Alberta first. You have given hope back to Albertans. You have made history. And to those who voted no, we need and want you in the United Party. If you have concerns, please express them through your active involvement." Brian Jean and Jason Kenney are both expected to announce their candidacy for the leadership of the new party shortly once it's formed. Derek Fildebrandt, who is the Wildrose finance critic, is also expected to throw his hat in the ring. Fildebrandt said he'll wait until the rules of the race are set before announcing his plans, and Calgary lawyer Doug Schweitzer has already thrown his hat in the ring for the leadership of the new party. And now you might be wondering, what does the NDP think of all this? What does the government think of all this? Well, Deputy Premier and Health Minister Sarah Hoffman said on Twitter, "The UCP offers the combination of PC entitlement plus Wildrose extremism and cuts. It all adds up to pain for Alberta families." So this was further reiterated in news media this week. She said, "This weekend was really about the parties being ready to embrace the worst in each other." This was said in an interview in Edmonton. She also said that the Wildrose are signing on to a PC party famous for its self-entitlements, and the PCs are linking up with a Wildrose team determined to make life worse for Albertans by promising budget cuts estimated to run into the billions of dollars. It's also worthy to note that this was the only comment from the NDP caucus this afternoon. Hoffman's tweet was retweeted by a couple of other MLAs, including Premier Rachel Notley herself. So here we have it. Unity agreement has been ratified and accepted by both parties here in Alberta.
Yeah, and beyond just a referendum for unity, with that high number voting in favor, 95% each, one could also make the argument that this is probably a kind of a referendum on the NDP government in Alberta too. Would
That's
you
right.
think?
Absolutely. And, I mean, just you have to look at the new membership numbers. Apparently, over the last 3 months, Wildrose has signed up over 20,000 new members who are taking part in this as well. So it's ordinary Albertans who are voicing their opinion in this process, and that's being reflected in these votes. So definitely something that the NDP are worried about, and I think that's why they're being so quiet on Twitter and media this afternoon when it comes to it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of PC members have come out to sign up for new memberships as well for the parties, as well as Wildrose.
Yeah,
so
under leadership, of course, Jason Kenney, that started actually last July.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you see a lot with new leadership races, is that whenever there's new leadership, there's a lot more members that sign up. I know that there was an overwhelming amount of people that signed up for new federal conservative memberships as well to vote in that race.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a very interesting time in these coming months and the prevailing 2 years before the next election here in Alberta to see what the reaction of the NDP is to this party, and perhaps more importantly, how the new party is treated by the mainstream media. Because as we can see here, Sarah Hoffman is already throwing out the narrative that they want the mainstream media to go with and that they want covered for this new United Conservative Party. Back when the Unity Agreement was first proposed, we actually went through a few of these bullet points here on the right side, and the new United Conservative Party actually looks like a party that is going to have founding principles that are going to be appealable to all Albertans, regardless of whoever they are.
Yeah, when you looked at the founding principles that we laid out, I guess that would be about a month or two ago now in an episode, a lot of the policies seemed actually very progressive for a conservative party. So it looked like a lot more appealing to, more moderate conservatives, you could say.
Yes. One final thing before we move on to BC. Going back to 2003 with the creation of the Federal Conservative Party of Canada, that merger was approved by 96% of the people in the Canadian Alliance at the time and 90% of the people in the Federal Progressive Conservatives. So they were nowhere near as close as these two were in terms of being both uniform in their decisions.
Well, I think when it comes to federal politics, when they were uniting, there was a lot of bigger issues. I think that were keeping the parties apart. You know, West versus East,
Right.
rural versus urban. But in Alberta, a lot of this just has to do with the NDP, I think, and them forming government when. If there was a united party, it would have been a landslide, basically, if you combine the two votes.
That's right. All right. So speaking of new governments, what have we got going on in BC?
Well, there's definitely a lot of new coverage on the newly sworn-in BC NDP Premier John Horgan, I'm going to have to get used to saying that, who unveiled his cabinet picks this past Tuesday. Prior to that, he, of course, promised a gender-balanced cabinet, much like Justin Trudeau did, and he said it would draw on all regions of the province, even though the NDP have only 4 MLAs outside of Metro Vancouver and Vancouver Island. So while the new 22-minister cabinet is indeed gender balanced, 14 of them are from the Metro Vancouver region, 5 are from Vancouver Island, and only 3 from other places in BC. So one of the things that we noticed about the NDP is that one of their big problems is the party's glaring lack of representation in the rural regions of the province, which, of course, Christy Clark's Liberals dominated in the election, basically which came down to natural resources. He's also appointed visible minorities and the first First Nations woman appointed to a BC cabinet, with Melanie Mark named as Advanced Education Minister. There were some thought that he would name Bowen Ma and Ravi Kahlon to cabinet, as both MLAs are under 40 and both are from South Asian backgrounds and both won swing ridings the NDP lost 4 years ago. But Horgan actually relegated both of those to parliamentary secretary positions, which are just below cabinet status. There was also some speculation that the MLAs who pushed Carol James out as NDP leader 6 years ago wouldn't be rewarded with cabinet posts either, but of the 6 James dissidents still in office, 3 of them, which were Katrina Conroy, Lana Popham, who happens to be my own MLA, and Claire Trevena, were still named to cabinet. Horgan, of course, backed James during that period, and the two have been allies, political allies ever since. For those who don't really know, Carol James was the leader of the NDP basically since their disastrous 2001 election, where they lost. They lost so badly. I think it was 77 out of 79 seats went to the Liberals, and the NDP were reduced to 2. So after that election, Carol James was elected the leader and ended up losing the 2005 and 2009 elections to former BC Liberal Premier Gordon Campbell, but she kind of brought back the party back to somewhat respectability from the late 90s and the early 2000s scandals that they were very well known for. So Carol James was named finance minister and deputy premier, and it's expected that she'll be Horgan's right-hand woman with navigating the party politics, as she has a lot of experience in that. Joining Carol James as former leaders who got named to cabinet is the new Minister of Health, which was former leader Adrian Dix, who of course lost the 2013 election to outgoing Premier Christy Clark. David Eby, who defeated Christy Clark in a by-election in Gordon Campbell's old riding of Vancouver Point Grey, will be serving as Attorney General. So it's been noted by the Globe and Mail the Global News rather, that several cabinet ministers several cabinet positions rather got renamed. Some got merged into one position, while others had duties split into 2 ministerial positions. So there are a few new positions which, when I read them out, you'll notice that they kind of reflect the change in priorities from the previous BC Liberal government to this new BC NDP one. So the new positions are a new Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions, and there's a new Ministry of State for Childcare. Those are 2 things that the NDP campaigned on pretty heavily in the election. There's also some splitting where the Ministry of Natural Gas and Housing is split into two separate ministries, and the Ministry of Jobs and Tourism and Labor and the Ministry of Technology, Innovation and Citizen Service were split into three separate ones. There's also been some renaming, which you'll probably notice very much sound like NDP renaming cabinet positions. The Ministry of Social Development got renamed into the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. The Ministry of Aboriginal Relations got turned into the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. The Ministry of Energy and Mines got turned into the Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. And the Ministry of Environment got changed into the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy.
Where have we heard this before?
I think you probably heard it in Alberta a few years ago, didn't you?
I think so.
Yeah. And also, very conspicuously removed, something that no articles talked about whatsoever, was that in making the new cabinet positions of mental health and addictions and the Ministry of State for Childcare, some ministries were actually removed, and one of them was the Ministry of Small Business, and the other one was the Ministry of Trade and the Ministry of International Trade, Asia-Pacific Strategy, and Multiculturalism.
So does this mean that this new government is not going to be focusing in on trade? Or are they going to be rolled into finance, or?
It looks like there is a Ministry of State for Trade, but as we know, the ministries of state are somewhat less important than the actual ministries. So we're noting here that overall, as expected, it appears that the new cabinet duties are more focused on more socially liberal ideas like climate change, social welfare, poverty reduction, mental health, child care, indigenous reconciliation, and less on business, trade, natural resources, and rural development. So that's something to note that a lot of the articles didn't actually mention, and I kind of had to piece them all together myself. So I think that's something that should have been covered a lot more in the media.
Definitely, especially with the issues recently with softwood lumber and the pending NAFTA negotiations that are happening at a federal level. But of course, the federal government will want provincial input on that.
Yeah. Something that's also been noted in a lot of articles is that Horgan's cabinet is heavy on experience as much as a party that hasn't been in power for 16 years can be experienced. Of the 16 NDP MLAs who have served since 2005, 12 of those were named to cabinet, and of the 14 NDP MLAs who are new to the legislature, just 4 of them were named to cabinet, and all 4 have experience in other forms of government, namely the school board, city council, teachers federation, and also in federal politics. So experience will come into play right away in dealing with the top priorities. There's a few that have been named by the new government. On the wildfire file, Horgan has tapped his most experienced cabinet minister, Mike Farnworth, to co-chair the cabinet committee. Farnworth, who is, of course, a former leadership candidate, and he also served in the cabinets of former premiers Glenn Clark, Dan Miller, and Ujjal Dosanjh in the 90s. He'll be ready to speak directly to evacuees while also dealing with staff on the ground, coordinating the firefight. So also on the news, with thousands still displaced by the province's raging forest fires, Horgan took a break from his first cabinet meeting to announce enhanced assistance for those impacted. Horgan also extended the provincial state of emergency by another 2 weeks and made an additional $600 available in assistance to those forced from their homes. Beyond the ongoing provincial state of emergency, the government has listed the softwood lumber deal, the fentanyl crisis, and education as top priorities in the short term. It's no surprise that all 3 politicians handling those files are very experienced ones who have been in the legislature since 2005. But neither Horgan nor his cabinet have any experience navigating a legislature with an NDP/Green one-seat advantage. The seat count, of course, as we've talked about many times before, is 44 to 43 when the new speaker is included. And maneuvering that balance will take political skill that we still don't know if Horgan or his cabinet possess, which was written by Mike Smith of the Vancouver province. And in another article, it's also noted that the new NDP government's transition to power cost taxpayers $11.3 million in severance packages for 133 fired Liberal political staffers, including ministerial assistants, public relations staffers, and a few deputy ministers. So if the government falls again shortly, taxpayers may not just be on the hook for another election, but a whole new round of severances as well. So we'll have to see how the new government holds up when the legislature reconvenes in September.
Yeah, that's a very important key point there regarding these severances, because, you don't normally think of that as a cost factoring in towards a new government, but it's there. And if this government is going to last a year, maybe, we could be doing this all again in a year with multiple severances. So maybe this could come into question when they deal with the campaign finance reform. Just as an outsider, was that at all mentioned in any of their priorities for the first sitting, campaign finance reform?
Campaign finance reform was noted as one of the major things in the merger deal, or not the merger deal, but the agreement between the Greens and the NDP. I haven't really heard much about it since then, of course, but it's supposedly still on the docket. But I'll have to look into that a bit more and see if there's anything else going on about that, because I haven't heard anything new about it. But like I said, it's just been 5 days that they've been in, so they've been focusing on the wildfires recently, which I think is the correct call at this point. It is.
Yeah, most definitely.
It is a huge problem right now with it affecting industry. It's affecting the natural resources sector. It's affecting homes and towns, like a whole bunch of them. It's affecting First Nations. It's a very huge problem. So that he focused his first day on that is probably a good thing. But it's also something to note that new governments can capitalize on disasters to try and fix things, right? We saw that happening. We saw that happening in the Depression era, where new governments would come in and then fix things, and then became wildly popular. So we'll have
to wait and see on that. But let's not hope that the wildfire is going to be used as a political instrument here. That would be bad.
Yeah, hopefully not. He has done some politics on that already, of course, but it's not like the Liberals who were in power I guess technically in power after the election. They were doing quite a bit with the wildfires as well. So it's something that at least both of the major parties have been putting, political differences aside for, which is what needs to happen, I think.
All right. Shall we move on to our next story?
Yeah, so let's move on to Canada, our Canadian story of the week. We're not actually going to be in Canada. We're going to be in one of Africa's poorest countries, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where more than $750 million US in mining revenue has disappeared before it could reach the national treasury. And the money from Canadian mining companies in the Democratic Republic of the Congo was diverted over a 3-year period, with much of it siphoned off by politically connected insiders at opaque tax agencies, according to a report by Global Witness, which is an independent research group. So the findings are really significant for Canadian mining companies, which have been major investors in the Congo and have given millions of dollars in payments to official agencies and state enterprises in the country.
$750 million US dollars is currently roughly 952 million Canadian dollars.
Yeah, so it's almost $1 billion, and that's a pretty significant amount, I think. So under new federal laws, Canadian mining and energy companies must disclose all payments to all levels of governments at home and abroad. Those disclosures, most of them released this year for the first time, show that Canadian companies have paid many millions of dollars to Congolese agencies. The report reads that, quote, Testimony and documentation gathered by Global Witness indicates that at least some of the funds were distributed among corrupt networks linked to President Joseph Kabila's regime. In a statement, Pete Jones, who is a senior campaigner at Global Witness, said, Congo's mining revenues should be helping to lift its people out of poverty, but instead huge sums are being siphoned away from the public purse and into uncountable agencies headed up by people with ties to political elites. Some of the transactions we've looked at paint a picture of these agencies as a cash machine for Kabila's regime. So for those who don't know about the Congo, it's one of the biggest countries in Africa by size, but it is also among the poorest. It is ranked 176 out of 188 countries in the latest United Nations Human Development Report, with 77% of its population surviving on less than $2 a day. Of course, more than 40% of its children have stunted growth because of malnutrition, and roads, hospitals, and schools are poorly funded and often in terrible condition. Yet at the same time, Congo has vast mineral resources which attract huge investments from foreign companies like Canadian mining firms because of its low production costs and high quality minerals. It is the biggest copper producer in Africa, and it produces 60% of the world's cobalt. Up to 10 billion worth of copper and cobalt is extracted and exported from Congo every year, yet only 6% of this revenue is reaching the national budget. So the report from Global Witness says that foreign mining companies that pay multi-million-dollar amounts in the Congo should use their influence to persuade the official agencies and state companies to become more transparent and publish audited annual accounts.
Yeah, the Congo and lots of these other poor African countries, Nigeria also comes to mind. You know, it all comes down to corruption. You know, we think we're sending money over there, corporations over there to do a good thing, but in more cases, it seems as time goes on that these pieces of money just get siphoned away towards corrupt corporations over there. And, you know, this is a major issue, and so much so that Apple, in their production of iPhones and whatnot, has actually temporarily, earlier this year, stopped buying cobalt from Congo because of the corruption that exists in that country. So it's an issue that is widespread.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of the money just heads into the hands of the leaders of the country, and none of it is going towards helping out the actual people of the country whatsoever. So it's a question if the companies have a duty, like a humanitarian duty, to try and lean on the governments in their agreements to try and, you know, get the money to try and help the people, or if it's, you know, as we've said before, if the business is just out to make, you know, profit for its shareholders. So it's a really big question when you're going into, you know, least developed countries such as the Congo, which have huge mineral resources. I mean, a lot of the diamond production and a lot of the gold production that comes out of Zimbabwe, for instance, you know, the blood diamonds, a lot of it really raises questions on how like Canadian mining firms get their resources abroad. But the problem is that if they stop, who's to say that other countries will just leap in and take the share?
Right.
Like China, for instance, has heavily invested in Africa.
Yeah.
So if Canada isn't there, you know, China is certainly not going to care about humanitarian rights whatsoever when they go in.
You know, I think one of the ways you could look at this, specifically since they're Canadian companies, is there could be some kind of incentive offered for the government to ensure that this money doesn't get funneled away to something that's corrupt or illegal in that area, maybe by way of tax cuts or something along the lines, incentives to just encourage honest activity going on there. So. Mm-hmm. All right, you ready to head back to Canada for the firing line?
Let's do it.
Okay, so this story comes from the National Post with the headline, Ottawa may have no choice but to repatriate, prosecute, capture Canadian ISIL members, experts say. Quote, the children of Canadian members of the so-called Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant form part of a potentially explosive dilemma confronting federal officials. As ISIL teeters on military defeat, what should the government do when and if Canadian members of ISIL are captured? Lauren Dawson, professor of sociology and legal studies at the University of Waterloo, says that the government has absolutely no choice but to protect the charter rights of those Canadians. Conversely, the French government has recently found out that it should be Iraq's court system who judges those who are captured when they were colluding with ISIL. So I think it's fresh in everyone's memory, specifically for this story here, that it seems to have come about because of the inevitable question, could a settlement like Omar Khadr's pave the way for others? It was only 2+ weeks ago that we talked about this on the show, when the Liberal government here in Canada paid former terrorist and Guantanamo Bay detainee Omar Khadr $10.5 million because his charter rights were violated. International reports and our own government estimate that there are roughly 100 Canadians that have gone to fight ISIL in the Middle East. Assuming these individuals are not killed, what happens to them when detained will be a question for the Canadian government. Of the 100 or so who went to fight ISIL, 15 to 20 were women, and most of whom have been reported to have children while they were away in the Middle East. The situation is complicated because, of course, if the child in question has at least one parent who is Canadian, that child also becomes a citizen of Canada. Another national security lawyer, Anil Kapoor from Toronto, says that ordinarily a citizen facing a charge in a foreign country will face justice in that country, but given that Iraq and Syria are war zones, Kapoor feels that they should be repatriated to Canada. The National Post also notes that once returned to Canada, they could face charges under Section 83 of the Criminal Code, which includes such acts as leaving Canada to join a terrorist organization, participating in or facilitating terrorist activity, or committing a crime for a terror group with penalties up to life in prison. What the National Post and other media outlets really didn't talk about is that under Section 46 of the Criminal Code instead, these individuals could be charged with high treason. In Section 46, high treason is defined as anyone who kills or attempts to kill Her Majesty or does any bodily harm tending to death or destruction, maims or wounds her, or imprisons or restrains her. B, levies war against Canada or does any act preparatory thereto. Or C, this is a clause that would affect most fighting with ISIL, assists an enemy at war with Canada or any armed forces against whom Canadian forces are engaged in hostilities, whether or not a state of war exists between Canada and the country whose forces they are. The Criminal Code further states that anyone found guilty of high treason is guilty of an indictable offense and shall be sentenced to imprisonment for life. While the piece initially wants to advocate for children of ISIL members, it loses that tone and quickly moves on to what should happen to the actual ISIL fighters themselves if captured and returns to Canada. Given the recent case with Omar Khadr, I think it's quite obvious that we will not find anyone in Canada sympathizing with payouts, given the polls we talked about last week. So this is really an issue that should be talked about more in the media regarding potential fighters that could be brought back to Canada, since the justice system practically doesn't exist in these countries.
Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes down to the children of the ISIL members, I think there is probably a duty to bring them back. But when it comes to the actual, ISIS fighters themselves, that's something that the courts are going to have an interesting time with, I think, in trying to decide. Now it remains to be the case if, Trudeau will just try and go outside the courts and give them money anyways, like he did with Khadr. But I think this is really something that the courts will have to decide if there is a legal or constitutional requirement for the government to repatriate them.
Right, and the whole Cotter case sets a precedent for something like this. Suppose, an American ally captures a Canadian who is fighting in Iraq against Allied forces for ISIL. What happens to that Canadian? Well, if they're detained and their charter rights are supposedly violated, we're on the hook again for another settlement. And I found it quite interesting that the story here talks about the children, but once you head into the story, there's only about 2 paragraphs, and these are, of course, article paragraphs, so maybe 3 to 4 sentences on the whole that actually talk about the issue of the children. So despite the title, that isn't actually dealt with in this piece, and it's more about advocating for the rights of former soldiers who have gone to fight for ISIS against Canada.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we see a lot of in journalism. They try and lead with a story that'll make them sympathetic to the public, and then later on in the story they'll go over stuff that they probably don't want them to see right away. I think that when you're reading an article, you'll find that the most interesting information is usually in the last 3 or 4 paragraphs of the article, just because that's where the things are that they don't want to mention up at the top.
Indeed, and that's the case here. And if indeed this is going to be a problem with the 100 or so that went over there and they're captured and not killed, well, that's a discussion that Canadians need to have, and the government needs to be held accountable for. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. All right. Well, I believe we got a good word of the week to sum up this edition of the podcast. What do we got for us?
That's right. Our word of the week this week is experience, and this is, of course, is defined as practical contact with and observation of facts or events, as in he had already learned his lesson by painful experience, or he spoke from experience. It can also be defined as the knowledge or skill acquired by experience over a period of time, especially that gained in a particular profession by someone at work. For example, older men whose experience could be called upon, or candidates with the necessary experience. It could also be defined as an event or occurrence that leaves an impression on someone. For example, for the younger players, it has been a learning experience. So the reason why we chose this week is that experience has been a word that has been thrown out a lot about the BC John Horgan's cabinet and how it is a good thing that they're experienced. But on the other hand, you could also argue that experience could also be a bad thing, in the sense that experience with the cabinet members could mean that a lot of older ideas are coming back to the forefront of the new government.
Specifically, probably older ideas of the 1990s NDP.
Yes, exactly. And I think I could speak for most British Columbians that would think that we do not want to go back to the 1990s NDP. Especially in 2017, which is, 2 decades removed from the 90s almost. So I think when it comes down to experience, it really depends on what experience they have and whether that's good or bad experience. And I think that's something that you have to remember with words as they're written in articles. People and journalists and the media can always use words to mean something, but that doesn't always mean that the words mean what they think it means, if that makes sense.
It's quite a bit of mental gymnastics right there, but I think I get the path that you're going on with that.
Yeah. I think you need a lot of experience to decipher that, I guess. But it's something that you really have to critically think when you're reading these articles is experience actually a good thing when it comes down to it? I think in some cases, yeah, you're going to want experience in running a province, for instance, but are you going to want too much experience so that you don't have room for new ideas or fresh faces or interesting takes on old problems? And certainly I think the NDP in BC could be described by some as an old problem. and it's going to be something that this new cabinet is going to have to work through.
All right, sounds good. Of course, we also have the experience of the 2003 federal conservative merger to kind of lead the path on the Alberta conservative merger. And we'll have to see if those involved in that party have the necessary experience to move forward and form government in 2019. But until then, that pretty much does us for this episode of The Right Side. Thank you for joining us, everyone. If you want to find more full show notes at rightsidenews.ca. Subscribe on iTunes at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes. And, of course, we're also on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. So until then, we'll see you next week, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
We'll bring you a whole new batch of stories for you next week. We'll see you then.